Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to restart. It's hard to follow on that, but we have a panel that will be able to do so. And as I mentioned at the start of the evening, or the day rather, but I cannot mention often enough, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation had the vision to give us relatively untrammeled money under this broad theme. There are a few other foundations I could name, Aranda, Sloan, a few others, who form a major part of the lifeblood of this institute, but none has been quite as involved over the last few years as the Niarchos Foundation. As I mentioned earlier and may come up later, they are doing incredible work in Greece at the moment, but also here. And we are very grateful to have a fully qualified scholar, Stelios Vasilakis, from the foundation to moderate the next panel. I will just make one other announcement, two announcements actually for the Institute. One is that a week from today in the afternoon, picking up on the discussion of this panel, we will be having another event on inclusive capitalism, what business and labor can do for quality employment. And on that panel will be Lynn Rothschild, who co-authored with me this op-ed recently on inclusive capitalism, but also Don Barton, the head of McKinsey globally, and Dick Gephardt, and, oh God, I forget his name, the gentleman from the Machinists Union, Alan Ballenbarger, the president of the Machinists Union. This will be another very interesting, stimulating event, and we encourage you to attend. So now let me turn it over to Stelios for the next panel.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Adam. I would like to thank the Peterson Institute on behalf of the Foundation and myself for inviting me here today for this very exciting conference and asking me to moderate this panel. And I also would like to thank Howard and Steve for the wonderful collaboration in this project. They've been working on this for over a year and a half, and I'm really, really happy to see that we're really moving forward with this. Now, before I start, I would like to say that I'm a classicist by training. Therefore, if Professor Gladstone said before that he's not an expert, I'm definitely not an expert. Now, what I thought I will do, I will try to frame the issue really briefly and then turn to the questions to my fellow panelists. Now, the theme of the panel is expecting ethical duties from private actors. And since we're talking about globalization, the focus when we talk about private actors will be non-government entities. In particular, we will focus on TNCs, transnational corporations. Now, under this umbrella of private actors, one can also point out to foundations and NGOs. And although they will not be the focus of this panel, I think the conversation will turn to them as well. Now, in the first panel, if I remember correctly, someone said that the distance between national and international welfare when we deal with globalization is not that great. That may be the case, but I firmly believe because TNCs, transnational corporations, operate in a complex, dynamic, and ever-evolving global environment, any debate about corporate social responsibility cannot be addressed, has to be addressed by international standards. It's not anymore the domain of a single country. It's not an issue of a national government anymore. We are dealing, what experts say in many cases, is soft transnational law and not hard national law. So we have to address a different set of questions when it comes to the ethical duties of private actors in today's global market. I will set a number of these questions, hoping that they will come up in the conversation that will follow, in addition to the questions that I will ask the panelists. What are the limits of corporate responsibility in today's environment? If we accept the assumption that corporations play a new role in a new global environment, how do we address issues of corporate social responsibility? Now, many corporations, together with NGOs, seem to have undertaken the role that traditionally governments take and try to implement certain rules. That gives corporations a political role. And we have to ask the question, what are the consequences of corporations assuming such a political role in a global landscape? Now, I will ask the first set of questions to George David, who I believe needs no introduction in this group. The literature is endless when we talk about corporate social responsibility. There are a number of issues that I would like to bring to your attention. One of them is that many people argue that the role of a transnational corporation is simply to focus on maximizing profits and leave regulation to the state. Therefore, transnational corporations have no business dealing with regulation. The only business is maximizing profits. Now, there is a strong reaction to that assumption. People believe, because we have a new set of rules, that corporations increasingly have to play a much more active role when it comes to corporate social responsibility. Now, what should that role be? Should they work together with NGOs and other entities to force certain changes? Should they self-regulate? When I talked to you earlier today, you thought that both of these questions were addressing issues to the extreme. That as a matter of fact, most of corporations, transnational corporations, do due diligence, and they do what has to be done. Can you address this, please?
I think there were several questions.
In the middle.
Thank you, Adam. There were several questions, Stelios, inside that broad set of comments, and I'm going to try to be brief and focused in answers here. In fact, not make any kind of a general statement, instead just try to deal directly with your questions, which is, first of all, I think we need to be careful to not put companies or corporations or TNCs or multinationals, as you call them, not to put them in the role of governments. That is to say, governments write standards. NGOs can reflect the opinions of societies and people and their own constituencies, and they can advocate and lobby, and they can try to persuade. But I don't think we want to have corporations go beyond their narrow scope of shareholder value, consistent with good corporate citizenship. That is the standard by which we need to run these large multinationals, and not, if you like, get diverted off into all other kinds of areas that more properly belong to governments or to NGOs. That doesn't say for a second that, in fact, I'm going to turn that around and say more forcefully that corporations have an absolute requirement to comply with law and regulation. It's unambiguous. I think you'll find that most big multinationals spend lots of resources, considerable resources, on compliance, not only with law in a narrow sense or regulation, but also beyond that to a broader sense like environment, health, and safety, and things of that nature. And you'll find also, and I'm going to come to this a little bit later, maybe in response to question or discussion, and not to take the time now. I think you'll find that if you look carefully at big multinationals, of course, we're governed by what we see in the newspaper, and what's in the newspaper tends to be what's reportable and therefore scandalous or sensational. And so you tend to generalize from the few things you hear in the newspaper that therefore everybody is like that. And the fact of the matter, and I will be forceful and informed in statements to you this afternoon, that multinationals in general operate to an extremely high standard of compliance and to efficiency and effectiveness in environmental protection and employee health and safety as well. I'll give you some examples later on from UTC, but I guess to come back and to wrap up on Stelios' opening question here, I don't think we should let corporations get put into the role of governments or NGOs, and their requirement instead is to comply with law and regulation to a high standard in some cases to go beyond that as they may choose to in their sole discretion and do things that they regard as reputationally good or nice to do. That's all okay, but all inside the primary metric of shareholder value.
Thank you. I would like to turn that reply and turn it into a question for Professor Sabel, who is the Maurice Timur Professor of Law and Social Science at Columbia University. There are numerous cases where multinational corporations routinely perform to standards higher than laws and regulations require. That's exactly what you said. There are also many cases with regard, for example, to labor standards and environmental regulations when they do not. What, if anything, should be done about these cases?
So let me.
Can I just be rude for a second? And the answer is prosecute them. Charles, pardon me for jump. I just couldn't stop those two words.
Well, we're in agreement. We're in agreement that it's an underreported fact that corporations, multinational corporations in general, often exceeds statutory requirements. And we're agreed that the profit motive, largely understood, is what is determining action. And so anything that's inconsistent with that is going to be hard to impose effectively. Now, let me look at some cases where corporations have come to see that it was in their interest, understood as centrally connected to their possibilities for profit, to impose on themselves or to associate with each other in jointly imposing codes of conduct that were not required by national governments and did not exist in international law. So that's the case in a lot of labor standards. In the 90s, the late 80s, 90s, through the last years, a number of corporations, typically not corporations that only sell wholesale, corporations that have retail names that can be jeopardized by association with unsavory or horrendous practices, have been brought typically by NGO-initiated campaigns to impose regulatory standards on themselves with regard to the treatment of workers, overtime, and a wide range of issues that would normally be the province of a domestic labor inspector to impose. So, fact one, they choose to do it under pressure. The pressure is related to the fact that the public gives the companies like Nike a license to operate, and really unsavory practices put that license in jeopardy, and the corporations respond. And they respond, I want to say, responsibly, in the sense that they made very sincere efforts to construct regulatory systems that are typically better than the regulatory systems in the more advanced countries. That is, the Department of Labor in the U.S. Doesn't have anything like the internal inspection capacity that Nike or HP has with respect to its first-tier suppliers. So these are, by the prevailing understanding of what an inspectorate is, good inspectorates, fact one. Fact two, the inspectorates don't work. These companies, because they were serious, have assembled a lot of data about what happens to findings of non-compliance, how responsive firms are, what's the stability of the individual firm's response, what's the tendency of development of the whole pool of suppliers, and the answer is it's noise. The repeated interventions by competent, dedicated, highly trained inspectorate produces essentially no net improvement. I mean, just very worst practices are eliminated, but it's a low ceiling. Okay, that's the and they've given this number to this data to a number of researchers. Everybody comes to the same results. I don't think that's contentious in the world of people who look at this seriously. The question is, what lesson do you draw from that? Well, the first lesson you can draw from it is that if you have a production system which is based, which these were initially through the 90s and up till almost the present, and then something happens. if you have production systems that are based on a radical distinction between conception and execution, we have a headquarters that designs, a factory that executes, and where there's a cascade of outsourcing from the executing factories to sort of simpler and simpler tasks get hived off in the Babbage principle and get parsed out to local subcontractors in countries without a strong tradition of the rule of law or any domestic regulatory capacity. Horrible things happen. Horrible things happen, and the Bangladesh fire is an example of that. It's not a singular thing. It is part of a kind of an expression of what happens where the first tier suppliers were under the scrutiny of serious corporations who are trying to fulfill their responsibilities. But if you have a model in which there are the headquarters demands more and more rapid response because inventories are expensive to hold and very familiar aggravated supply chain issues under current conditions. If you run a system like that based on subcontracting, there are going to be swings in demand and huge strains on the production system, and things are going to tighten in a way which makes it uncontrollable. It's not a matter of whether the corporations are driven by profit or anything else. They literally do not control what goes on outside the purview of this well-intentioned, well-financed, but ultimately ineffective system. Okay, so that, by the way, is not just that's not just a reflection of what goes on in developing countries. When we were just there was an earlier exchange about the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, and it was said correctly, it was 1911, and then some years later, like 20 years later, like in the New Deal, there was a different model of production. The model of production shifted from the sweatshop, where the owner of the factory owned nothing, rented the building, rented the machines, paid people by the piece, and had no incentive at all to take preventive measures, to an elaborate mass production system, today called a bundle system, where there were big investments in the division of labor, in certain kinds of machinery, in fixed facilities, in training of intermediate kinds of workers. And it was that shift which made the fire danger and many other associated dangers subject to a much more effective regulatory control. So lesson one, you cannot, the issue of whether it's a public or a private regulator cannot be discussed in abstraction from the question of what's the problem to regulate? How is production organized? Okay, so now, the follow-on question would be, is there any reason to think that the production model that gave rise to the Bangladesh fire and which occasioned the development of what has proven to be an ineffective standard-setting system is changing? Because if it's not changing, then we can talk about this a lot, but if what I just said up to this point is true, it won't change the prospects for effective regulation. Now, good news and bad news. The production model is changing. The production model is changing in the sense that there is an explosion, two separate and complementary things. Co-location of design and production is becoming a necessity. Rapid prototyping to scale is becoming a necessity because markets are fluctuating. You need to produce differentiated products for big local markets like China and India, to take obvious examples. The pace of technological change, all of these things mean that people have understood. This is just a new fact about manufacturing. Not only manufacturing, but service delivery too, but we're talking about manufacturing. About manufacturing is that you have to co-locate facilities and reintegrate production and execution. And you can see this beginning to happen. You can see it beginning to happen in changes that are going on in Foxconn, in many, many settings. And you can see it even in the beginning of the return of manufacturing to the United States, not least to Silicon Valley, where you're seeing high-tech firms wanting to set up production facilities close by, not to create American jobs, but in order to maintain this integration of, okay. Now, under those conditions, it turns out, these things are much more easily regulated. They are, the bad news is they are less labor intensive. They don't absorb, they don't produce as many jobs. Industrialization is not likely to be the high road to economic prosperity that it has been since the Industrial Revolution made industrialization and modernization synonymous. This change in manufacturing is going to be less labor intensive, but it is producing a much deeper integration of manufacturing and design and much greater ability of parent corporations to control these things. And the debate, there is a shift in these standard setting bodies away from a checklist kind of compliance where there's a set of rules, and the goal is to see whether the supplier follows the rules, whether the fire extinguishers are located in the right places, and so on, to looking at the root cause of the underlying problem and eliminating that, the way you would in with regard to any other problem in a modern manufacturing facility. Okay. Last point. This change is not that we've been talking about this as though it was a problem of labor standards in international space. This change is converging with a much broader change in the nature of regulation itself. This comes back to the point that Barney Frank was making. I want to return to it, and I want to provide a somewhat different answer not different, but a complementary answer to the one he was providing. The background premise of this panel is which is better, which is more effective, which is the balance of benefits to costs more favorable, private regulation or public regulation. If you look into the future, look at regulatory systems that are addressing the kinds of problems that come up in labor standards and all the other issues that transnational corporations face. What you see is the emergence of a new architecture of regulation. So let me describe that in 2 minutes with respect to something topical. I'm sure many of you saw that there was a story in the Times yesterday or the day before saying that the FDA had released rules to implement the Food Safety Modernization Act of 1910. I'm sure all of you are close followers of the Food Safety Modernization Act of 1910, so you clicked onto the link that showed you what the rules are. Now, why is that? Why is the Food Safety Modernization Act and the rule relevant? Foods has become unsafe because supply chains have gotten very long. When supply chains get very long for uncooked foods like leafy green vegetables where the pieces are mingled in the salads that we all eat for lunch, maybe ate for lunch today, and the individual pieces come from all over, the dangers of contamination go up exponentially because the pieces can be contaminated at the source. There's cross-contamination there, and the processing apparatus can get contaminated. And the result is that you have a little laboratory for producing, a little petri dish for producing hazards that show you what the risks of globalization are. And these could be labor hazards, they could be anything. It's a very general problem once you get long supply chains. The problem was left unresolved under the Bush administration. The Bush administration refused to regulate, to impose some form of regulation on the leafy green industry in particular, because they believed that this was best done privately. The Leafy Green Association, there's a buyers association, imposed privately for profit motive, because when food is contaminated, everyone stops buying that kind of food. When there's a spinach scare, no one buys spinach. The leafy green wholesalers made as a provision of buying food that people obey a very complicated regulatory system. The regulatory system, it's not complicated, it has a simple architecture. The architecture is each farm or factory produces a plan showing where the hazards in its production are, where pathogens could enter the process over which it has control. The government, or in this case, inspectors hired by the Leafy Green Association, review the plan, and they see whether the preventive measures have demonstrably worked. They verify test results of that, and they pool information from all the plans to see whether some plans are omitting hazards that they should include. Okay? So that model in which the firm has responsibility for identifying the hazards, but there is a collective pooling of understanding of where the hazards are and whether they're being successfully mitigated, became the model for the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's now the FDA. The firms will have the same obligation, but it's the FDA that will do the pooling. Okay? That model is diffusing very rapidly in realms of regulation where there's a great deal of uncertainty. The government can't possibly anticipate where all the hazards are and writes rules, so it's dependent on on deep private participation, but the deep private participation is subject to a review that pools the experience of all the relevant private participators. Okay, so end of story. A first period in which we had the modern equivalent of the sweatshop, and neither the governments by inaction nor firms by sincere concerted action were able to address it. An ongoing shift in production to a form of reintegration of conception and execution that is much better at dealing with uncertainty, the inability to anticipate exactly what the risks are going to be, and associated with that, the emergence of a form of regulation with a new division of labor between the private sector and the regulatory sector, where neither one is allowed to act autonomously, and where their relation is not just that they confer once to agree on rules which are then enforced, but that they have to collaborate on an ongoing basis to continue to update the rules.
Thank you. I will turn now to Kimberly and Elliott, who's also very well known in this institution. She has been a fellow at the Peterson Institute for many, many years, and she's now a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, where she writes on trade policy and globalization. You have worked a lot on labor laws, and you have said that labor standards and trade in a globalized environment are considered by many as complete opposites. Can, as a matter of fact, adequate labor standards at a global level and expanded trade coexist? Can adequate global labor standards be enforced in today's environment? And I have a second question that relates to this as well. The debate about globalization is often framed around the question of whether it constitutes a race to the bottom or the top in terms of labor standards. Which direction do you think we are heading, and what can be done to influence a positive outcome?
Thank you, Stelios. Those are some big questions. I'll try and address them briefly. I think what I'm talking about is still mostly based on the book that I did with Richard Freeman several years ago now. Can globalization standards improve? I've forgotten the title, under globalization, something like that. And we basically concluded that, in fact, there are positive synergies between globalization and labor standards, and that they certainly could improve together. Not necessarily that they would just sort of on their own without working at it, but that certainly they could, that globalization helps to contribute to the growth and rising incomes that also allows labor standards to rise, but that labor standards are an important part of making globalization both politically acceptable and making it more equitable and therefore, in our view, durable. And in terms of this race to the bottom question, here again, and this connects to the comments by both George and Charles, where I guess I'm less visionary than Charles. Maybe we're moving to this new production model. I think what we have right now is lots of different production models, and I expect that to continue for at least some time. And so I think what we tend to see is that where it is direct investment, particularly by US or European multinationals. Clearly, they do have an obligation to abide by the laws and to uphold laws where they are operating, and I think in general, probably they do. And we often do see rising working conditions in many of those situations. I think it also differs by sector, so both of those things. But I tend to agree with George David that it has to do with the bottom line and what's going to serve the bottom line. And in those sectors, you see rising wages and working conditions, as we're starting to see in parts of China now, because of you need higher productivity. You see that in the relatively more capital-intensive industries where worker retention and worker skills are relatively more important. And so basically it's a market phenomenon. It's going to lead to some raising improvement in conditions. Where we tend to get the problems is in what Charles did make explicit, is where you have multinationals operating as traders and buyers. And they have less control. As Charles said, they're operating in these very long supply chains, which are very difficult to monitor because they may have hundreds or thousands of suppliers scattered around the world. You also get to problems from the factory perspective of having to comply with 6 or 7 different codes depending on how many different corporations you're selling to. So as he said, I think the consensus is I think it's probably been helpful in a lot of cases, but ultimately it's really not the solution. And in part it's not the solution. I've just put out a paper on fair trade, your fair trade certified coffee. And what's very different about that model, they focus on, for pure feasibility reasons, short supply chains, because that's the only way you can credibly certify something is fair trade, is if you have a roaster, a trader, and a producer. But the other thing that's key there that's very different from the corporate social responsibility model is that it's a conscious objective to change the relationship between the buyer and the producer. And I think the problem with corporate social responsibility, I would really argue that it's a misnomer, because I don't think the multinationals are really taking responsibility. They want to protect their reputation, their brand name, and so they set up these codes and they set up this monitoring. Quite often they're not even paying the cost of monitoring. They leave that to the factory to pay the direct cost of the monitoring itself. But fundamentally what they're not doing is changing their buying behavior. So if you look at the Apple Foxconn example, right, you are going to have people working huge amounts of overtime, 24 hours a day, if you say, I have to have this new screen for my Apple next week. It simply can't be done without having people work overly long hours that could be damaging to their health. So in that sense, I think that's what's been missing. That's the one thing that's been missing from the conversation, is that corporations, for the most part in these monitoring efforts, have not been willing to change what they do control, which is their buying behavior. The second missing element here, and this goes back to we're talking about private actors here, and I think ultimately what's required, this is an enforcement problem, not for the most part a legal or standards problem. Most developing countries have pretty good labor laws on the books, but they're not enforced. Ultimately, in the long run, that's got to change. The other thing, though, that's got to change is workers. Rather than trying from outside to protect workers, we should be trying to empower workers. Because they can then bargain over what matters most to them. Is it having a nice dorm, or is it getting higher wages so that they can send them back home to their families in rural China? Is it working? There are now complaints from the Foxconn workers. Well, we want to work more than 49 hours a week because we need that money. Now, there have to be some limits on that, again, within what's the range of what's helpful. But you're going to get the most efficient outcome if workers are in a position to bargain over what matters most to them. Secondly, in terms of then enforcement, of course, they're the ones that are on the factory floor every day. It's not a monitor coming in once a year, if that often, and going down a checklist. So really, in terms of both of these things, both in terms of setting the standards at the factory level and in terms of monitoring it, I think that really what we should be talking about is how do we empower workers to protect themselves. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Stelios, can I just note that I think both these prior sets of comments have fundamentally run to control and monitoring of contractors' behavior as compared to assurance of environment, health, and safety in owned and operated facilities. And I certainly endorse and agree with the requirement to monitor and oversee and require standards and performance and behaviors from contractors. But I just wanted to note that we're often into a special space of third-party control when we also need to pay attention to to me, the primary instance or the first instance of first-party control, that is your own operations. It was just a point of information.
And that was certainly the case with the fire in Bangladesh, where we know for a fact that an NGO who was in charge of inspection has said that fire regulations were in place. So that obviously did not work. One of the issues that is regularly discussed when we talk about transnational corporations is self-regulation. A lot of people make the argument that corporations should be allowed to self-regulate. And I want to turn to Sir Evelyn de Rothschild, who is also very well known in this foundation and needs no introduction whatsoever, and ask a couple of questions. That one relates to self-regulation and the other relates to the concept of strategic ethics. Should transnational corporations be allowed to self-regulate when it comes to rules and standards? How effective is self-regulation? The other issue I would like you to address is that I would like you to consider the concept of strategic ethics, which is basically the notion that socially responsible behavior by companies results in good business. If that's the case, is it enough to legitimize corporate social responsibility?
Thank you. I think we could be here till the sunset, but on that question, as it is certainly not
A couple of hours, I think.
it's a huge, huge problem. I think the most important thing which you're touching on is the whole question of confidence and whether confidence exists. J.P. Morgan made a speech in 1932 where he said if you're a good banker, you have to behave towards your customer in a measured way and look after them correctly and ethically. I know that was a different world in the 1930s, and whatever you may think has happened since. And of course, there's been endless books written about the problems that have faced the banking industry and the financial world, and the question of how you contain the principles of confidence for the customer. I'm sure everyone in this room probably have bank accounts, and maybe some of you have lost confidence in the banks you're dealing with or not. The result, though, is that one has to look back at what has happened in relation to the movement of banks and the financial world from, if you like, locally being involved, whether it was in the United States, locally in the United Kingdom, France, Europe, throughout. And suddenly, the opportunity, I think globality was the biggest change that took place when people moved across from one country to another and perhaps thought that the regulation in one country would be adequate to cover them in the other country. And they've pretended, if I can use that word, that self-regulation existed and that it was all right. But of course, we all know that it wasn't all right, and in a very short space of time, we saw the differentials. The other thing that happened, which is basic, and of course, people's memories are good on this and some aren't, commercial banks basically were making a return of about 11 or 12% on their capital, and investment banks were making 20 or 25 or more percent. And there was a self-involved jealousy factor, if I can use that expression, of why should those fellows across the road be making all the money and we are struggling just lending money to boring subjects when they go out and do exciting operations in taking over companies and being investment bankers. And the regulators, I don't think, understood it when you look back 40 years. And it's probably in the late 70s when this started to change, certainly in the United Kingdom. And it moved very much faster than people realized. The other point, which I think is terribly important, and I bring you up to date today, is that if you're a regulator, and I have to be careful because I'm sure there's some in this room, but to be a regulator, you've certainly got to know what you're regulating. In the case of the United Kingdom, again, the FSA was a failure. it didn't regulate the banks correctly. And one of the reasons why it didn't regulate them is because the question of money comes into it. And money actually comes into the whole question. I'll talk in a little while about the question of ethics. But in the case of regulators, you have to pay people to regulate who are people who are paid 50 times more than the regulator. Now, we all know what that means. I'll give you a parallel. You may think it's funny, but many, many years ago, in soccer, which was played in England and played partly here, all the soccer teams were refereed by amateurs. They weren't paid anything. And then they suddenly realized that the soccer players were earning up to £100,000 a week for kicking a football, and they realized that maybe the referees should be paid too. And they started paying them a decent fee because they realized that the soccer players couldn't care less what the referee said to them when they kicked the ball the wrong way or knocked someone over. And if you take the same example in banking or the financial world, this is what happened. And today, I still think, and I put a proposition forward the other day, and I still believe it, that all banks should, by a percentage system of working it out, put money into a pool, which then the regulating system or the central regulator would be able to indulge in hiring people with a decent salary to do the regulation. So that's a very important factor, which I think caused a lot of problems, and we saw that. And then you get on to the question of ethics. Well, the question of ethics goes back in history. I mean, you know, it's not for me to say, but imagine people are brought up in a disciplined family with tradition, and they think and they reflect. And at the same time, they take on a job, whether it is in the financial field or in the industrial field or wherever field they're going into, and they see the opportunity of working for the company in the best sense of the word. But at the same time, someone might see the opportunity of making more money if they worked outside and did other things, and the money factor gets more and more important, and we've seen that again too during the traders on the floors. The traders were much more interested in making money, and they were rather like footballers because they used to be moved across from one company to another. If a fellow made $50,000 this week and the fellow came up and said, look, if you come to me, we'll make $100,000 next week, they moved across. Now, is that ethically right? No, but it has happened. And I'm not here to talk about certain companies, but there are two examples recently of the same sort of thing. One is UBS, and the other is Evelyn, both Swiss banks, who inveigled on the point of convincing US citizens that if they opened accounts with the banks, they wouldn't have to pay US tax. And they've now, it's public knowledge, and they've all been had up, and one of the banks, the Evelyn, which is probably one of the oldest small bank in Switzerland, is closing down. And you had the same situation in the United Kingdom, where we had operations of some of our banks. I have to be careful what I say with Adam here, who probably followed it closer than I did, but where they were offering money for people to do things which they shouldn't. And how do you stop it? Do you stop it by private regulating, which is what you suggested maybe we should discuss? No, you have to have central, proper regulation done by a combination of the government of the country and the central bank. The two have got to work together. There's another example I give you where it's failed, in my opinion, and I, many years ago, suggested something should be done. I think hedge funds are an absolute disgrace to modern finance. They've never done anything for the community. They've only done it for them, self-indulging, making a lot of money. And hedge funds should have been licensed. What is the difference between a hedge fund and a man brokering in the corner of his office in a bank? Personally, I don't see any difference. Even the bookies on the racetrack are licensed. So, and to my opinion, a hedge fund is not much better than a bookie on a racetrack. But all these things come down to the fact of whether you're brought up with a standard of understanding what your discipline is in life. The highest form of ethics in the world, without a doubt, is medicine. Health, doctors are probably the best example of really good ethical behavior. And they are licensed, and if anything goes wrong, we know what happens. Bankers are not the highest form of behavior. I'm not saying that I'm against banking, but I believe that they have to be taught, and I have to be careful what I say. But the other thing, if I may, and then I'll shut up, in relation to this country, you have a much bigger problem, which is not to do with, it's to do with ethics, but of a different sort. You have trespassed into the electoral system by allowing people to pay billions of dollars to become president of the United States or to become elected to your Congress. We have very, very strict rules. I think that for the younger generation and future generations is one of the most dangerous things that's happened to America, because you cannot believe, I would say maybe 80% of the people are honest, but you only need to have that huge sum of money being spread around to gain political advantage, being used unethically. And I'm very sad to think, because we love this country and we know what a great country it is, that no one stands up to change this or to control it. Many, many years ago, I, with a very important American industrialist, went to Washington with a plan and put it forward, saying, why don't you just look at what we do in England and try and look at, and they just threw it out of the window. They weren't interested. But I think that, if you don't set an example on ethics at the top, how do you expect people at the bottom to behave correctly?
Thank you. I want to go back to a different issue that relates to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation as a philanthropic organization, and I would like to encourage all four of you to comment on this. It's clear now that transnational corporations find themselves exceedingly operating in very unstable environments, whether there are political environments, social, economic environments, whatever. And the outcome of operating in such an unstable environment is that safety regulations, especially when it comes to labor laws and the environment, the way we understand them in this country, simply do not exist there, or they exist and they're completely inadequate and antiquated. So one question is to ask corporations in this instance to self-regulate and make sure that they apply the highest standards possible. What is exceedingly asked of them is to get involved with government, because they have the power to influence policy, to get involved at a different level and make sure that all the proper laws and regulations do take effect. We as a foundation have to face a similar situation in Greece. We do a lot of philanthropic work there. We have just announced a €100 million initiative to support people suffering from the crisis. And because the government is collapsing and the social welfare state is in complete retreat, we've been asked exceedingly to influence policy, to make sure that things change and the right decisions are made. Now, we firmly believe that we cannot replace the government, we cannot replace the state. So where we make sure that all the right steps are made when it comes to supporting NGOs, we firmly avoid to get involved with policy decisions. And a lot of people think that this is an ethical question, that the foundation has an opportunity now to influence certain decisions. And then I believe that that applies to a lot of transnational corporations today. And I want to raise this issue and ask, is it ethical to just self-regulate, or is it ethical to take the right action and decision and make sure that the proper steps are taken, and that's open to all four of you.
Let me venture an answer, and because the question you raise goes back to the question of this panel: is it public or private? I think the first thing to say is that that's the wrong question when the fundamental problem is that nobody knows the right thing to do. If you know the right thing to do, you can argue about, you think someone knows the right thing to do, then you can argue about who that person is, the firm or the NGO, or if no one knows the right thing to do, then you have to organize joint investigation. And you can only I agree completely with Sir Evelyn that you cannot rely on people. It's not just bankers. I teach at a law school, and they're not doctors. So I think, and those are professions. Those are all professions with which are supposed to have an ethos. So you cannot rely on people to self-regulate, even though you might think that because they are the actors closest, they know where the shoe pinches, because they have the most local knowledge. But local knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. You need, in time, as in the current period, you need to find answers to these questions that no single corporation, no government regulator can find his or her itself. So you have to organize this collaboration. Organizing that form of collaboration, I think, is the central problem. I don't think that it's a problem related to labor standards, and I think that the case you raise, where a government is collapsing, and this would be the dream of certain NGOs and foundations, is finally somebody has the courage to ask us to come and impose what we know to be right. And I think the worst thing you could do is accept that invitation. But I think that refusal should be a guide to everyone in the room with respect to their own self-limited knowledge.
Stelios, I heard two questions there, which is, first of all, what about self-regulation by TNCs, as you call them, or multinationals? And second is, what about going beyond self-regulation to get involved with governments to cause performance by others? And I have, I think, crisp answers on both, which is the second one first. The answer is no. That is to say that the charter of public companies, for-profit entities, is to conduct their affairs consistent with law and regulations in the societies in which they operate. And they may choose to set higher internal standards, and that's all okay, and they can do that. That's a voluntary matter. But they should never be drawn into trying to replace the role of governments. Governments do what governments do, and NGOs do what NGOs do, and that's enough. Secondly, the issue of self-regulation, I believe very strongly in that. It doesn't mean that self-regulation replaces external regulation or external standards. To the contrary, it means that it reinforces and extends, by which I mean that you start from a fundamental proposition. You will comply with law and regulations wherever you do business. I've used for years the phraseology that our organizations will comply to the higher of local or U.S. standards, whichever is higher, and that we will audit, inspect, and require performance to those standards. And if you do all that, you actually get some remarkably good results. So to me, again, the short answer is you can't get TNCs involved in the affairs of governments in any significant way or other than peripheral way, and you need to rely upon self-regulation, but inside the framework of laws and regulations and standards set by others.
Maybe just add a little bit more on that in the context of labor standards, and I think environment as well. There are a range of, in the case of labor standards, there is the International Labor Organization. There are lots of multi-stakeholder kinds of initiatives. So I would agree with George. I think that it would be, sort of a foreign corporation getting engaged in politics in one of its in a country, I think it would be not viewed as legitimate, even if they're, we're doing the best thing in the world for everybody involved. It's just a very difficult situation, I think, both for assuming that it is, a democracy in the country where you're operating, potentially a problem, and clearly a problem for the company. I think that doesn't necessarily say that there's nothing to be done at all, because there are a range. I would say look for a multi-stakeholder initiative, something that brings in lots of different parties, and it's sort of going to what Charles was saying, try and organize that conversation around, what is it that we want to do and how do we best get there sort of collectively.
Well, I can only speak in relation to two experiences in my life. One is being a director of one of the world's most important mining companies, where obviously you work with government and private sector, so it was a combination of public and private situation. You had your self-regulation of the mining world, hard rock, and safety requirements, and all the necessary need for mining in one sort or another, whether it was offshore or online. And also, you had to pay attention to the local government regulations. So it was a sort of multi-attitude which had to be taken. The other one, which more recently I was involved in building a new town in England between London and Birmingham. It now houses 300,000 people, and we built 4,500 houses every year. And there you had the planning rules and regulation, which were laid down by the government, but then you individually were responsible for being a self-regulator to make sure that everything was carried out according to what you knew, and you couldn't deviate away from it. And as far as I know, we didn't trespass into areas which we shouldn't have trespassed into, and we were very careful to watch over it. And so I think it's very hard to say that you can be a self-regulator without being combined with the government of the day or the country in which you're involved. Obviously, there are some countries in the world where there isn't good regulation, so you have to be much more dependent on yourself to make sure, and of course things like safety, fire precautions, all the necessary insurance liabilities are quite complicated. But once that is done, hopefully you have a success story at the end of the day.
But one of the issues that he discusses is whether or not for transnational corporations to have access to local markets, and I mean by that to US or European Union markets, whether they have to follow the protection of public health and safety laws and laws that protect the environment at a transnational level. Otherwise, if you found to be negligence in Bangladesh, should you have access in the local markets here? And that's again open to each one of you in this panel.
Well, again, let me say something. This is not speculation. That is, with regard to the environment, the current WTO law has, as clarified very recently in the, again, something all of you are following closely, the U.S. Tuna 2 decision of June of this year, the process product distinction has broken down. So when the WTO was created, the idea was regulating exchange of goods. So features of goods, you could exclude goods which harmed your citizens in virtue of the features of the good itself. You couldn't exclude a good because the process by which it was produced harmed the environment with which you were connected or harmed people in the country who produced it. So there was a distinction between product and process. That distinction has now broken down. There's a long series of cases, and it is now completely acceptable in WTO law for countries to impose environmental restrictions on the way tuna is harvested or shrimp is harvested, so tuna to protect dolphins, and many other examples that have been litigated before the WTO. Provided they can impose those restrictions, they can exclude non-conforming goods made by a process that doesn't meet their standard, provided they've given the exporting country the right to meet the standard in its own way. That is, they can't impose the mode by which the standard is met, and or the country can put forward a compelling explanation of why the standard shouldn't apply. So we're not talking about the question is, will that be extended to labor? The issue is not will the WTO be consistent with the ban on some products because of the way they're made. The question is, what features of the way they are made will be subject to WTO regulation? And there, labor is much harder than the environment. There's no doubt about that. But there is this fact. I will. Kim was nice and said I was being visionary in my idea of a shift in production models. Visionary is the polite word for crazy idealist crank. I don't think so. I think if Apple has an Apple Academic Advisory Board that looks at these issues, I'm on it. I see what this board does is survey where supply chains are going. And the supply chains are going in the direction of this reintegration. George has made a big point, and correctly, of saying that when production is not vertically, when it's integrated, there is reliable control. But we have been through a period where production was very dramatically disintegrated. We are now moving back not to vertical integration again, but more intimate forms of coordination. As that happens, corporations will be held more liable for the labor performance. Whether or not that's regulated becomes acceptable as a basis for discrimination of goods under the WTO is an entirely open question, but not an entirely speculative one.
Can I say one thing? Yeah. Go ahead. Yes. I think the biggest advancement that's made in my lifetime, and I'm sure all of you would agree, is food. When one was young, there was nothing on a package of food that said what was inside the package. And the WTO has played a big part now in playing its part in defining very carefully, are they peanuts or hazelnuts or whatever the nuts are that are put in the package, and where they come from and what is their life and how long they last. And I think that is a big step forward. The area which maybe we aren't here to discuss, but I think on the environment, the biggest worry today on the environment is not to do with the human side, but is the animal side in wildlife in Africa. And if you look at what is going on there, where there's no controls in some of those countries, where elephants are being killed, tusks are being illegally cut up and shipped out, and all the material taken out of animals and sold. Japanese like to, I don't know, eat the milk from a rhino or whatever they do. I mean, it is quite extraordinary what is going on, and it's very, very dangerous. That sets an example which worries, because if it can happen in a country, how does the rest of the country control what it calls its essential harvesting, its essential goods? That is, I think, the next big step in environmental problems, as well as obviously rainforests and all the rest of it. But you've got to link the environment to the natural habitat, because the two do come together in the sense of intellectually making people aware of discipline, because they've got away with an awful lot of undesirable activity. And I think that is a subject which is worth registering, even if it isn't a priority for the WTO.
Stelios, rather than add another answer to your question, which I think is already well covered, I might just take a moment and introduce an additional theme, which I think is rarely talked about in topics or conversations like this, which is the idea is that we are not necessarily a system in tension or in opposition. That is, a lot of the words we've heard today from even 3 panels so far, and like the 4th as well, is that we have opposing interests, and when somebody wins, somebody loses. And I think that actually, that's true in large parts of life, but then again it's not true in large other parts of life. And I want to just throw a couple of examples out here by way of reinforcing the idea that compliance and responsible corporate behavior that minimizes impact on an environment, maximizes employee welfare, and things like this are actually good for profitability. So it's, if you like, it's goodness times 2, which is it's good for the environment and it's good also on the bottom line. I'll give you one example, or actually I'm going to give you 2 very quick examples here. One is the energy consumption by this big multinational United Technologies Corporation. It's a $60 billion company with 200,000 employees. It's 3 times larger now than it was 15 years ago, and the energy consumption is 30% less. 3 times larger, and energy consumption in kilowatts and BTUs is 30% less, and so is carbon footprint. And by the way, energy costs money, and so that's goodness times 2. It's less environmental impact materially, and it's less expense as well. Other things, water consumption is down by half. A third one is lost workday incidents. That is a safe place to work, which is a fundamental requirement. People need to come to work every day with the expectation that absolutely there is an uncompromising standard to a safe place to work. In our case, the lost workday incidence rate in the United States is down from just under 3 per 100 per year in the early 1990s today to 0.3 per 100 per year. And that drop is in the range of 85 or 90%. And we just need as a footnote to note that a lost workday incidence case in the United States costs $30,000 per case. And so if you get rid of the cases, you make a safe place to work, and you clearly recover any expenditures you had to make a safer place to work from the fact that you don't have the injuries in the first place. I just want to make a strong, unqualified statement that we're not a system in tension or opposition. If you look for goodness, goodness will oftentimes pay for itself.
Should I open it to the floor, or do we have time for one more?
No, I'd like to give it over to the floor.
Okay, please.
Thank you. I wanted to go a little bit further into the discussion that you started with. You started with ethics, and then you went into corporate social responsibility. And I really don't think that those 2 things are equivalent. You know, I distinctly remember a conversation with the spouse of a leading person in one of the LIBOR scandal banks saying, you know, we're being attacked for this, but nobody recognizes we give 30 million pounds to charity. So I don't think that they're really, they really don't replace each other. But I think it gets a little more complicated in another British scandal, which I'd like your view on. The British right now are very upset that, in particular, Starbucks, Google, and Amazon have made millions of pounds of profit in the UK and have in some cases paid a few $100,000, I mean tens of millions, a few $100,000 million in taxes. And of course, it was all perfectly legal. And it goes back to Professor Page's point about transfer pricing, which is totally legal. And so the question is, and it's being discussed in Britain, that perhaps paying taxes is really corporate social responsibility. That you can so easily decide what your tax rate is as a multinational, that you decide what you owe a country, and you make an ethical decision about that. This has been offered. I'd like to have the opinion of the panel on that question, or at least one person.
Okay, I'll jump into that frying pan easily, Lynn. Of course, it's my familiar theme, compliance with law is fundamental. Secondly, if there's a problem with tax regulation and tax collections in a society, I represent that it's a two-party deal. That is, you may have the offender or you may have the person that understood the tax code, and then you have the people that wrote the tax code and the people that enforce the tax code. So the answer is yes, people should pay taxes. They shouldn't pay taxes as a voluntary act. They should pay taxes in consequence of compliance with law and regulation. And it's a two-party deal. That is, it's the regulator or the statute or tax code writer. And if there are, and also, by the way, I'd like to rebut, I heard it a couple of times today that transfer pricing is somehow kind of an unregulated space into which people can take a long dive and have a wonderful time. The answer is categorically not. Transfer pricing is very strictly regulated, reviewed, supervised, and inspected by competent tax authorities all over the world. And there are rules and procedures by which you actually do transfer pricing, and it is subject to audit, extensive audit, and review, and sanction.
But what's happening is, for Starbucks, for instance, people are boycotting. So, because they're paying no tax and taking out so much money from Britain. Sorry.
I think we need to refer to the specifics of that instance. That is, are they paying no tax, and if not, why not? Then I think somebody may wish to speak to, is it inland revenue, I think you call it? Yeah. Or to the parliament. I don't think we should, you can't expect corporations to adopt voluntary standards in excess of applicable law. You cannot do that. That is simply a diversion. Big companies are not charities. Big companies exist to foster innovation, to employ people, to supply products, to achieve ever higher standards of product safety, product reliability, to advance the frontiers of civilization. That's what they do. But they don't do it voluntarily. They do it inside a framework that is established, written, codified, confirmed, and enforced by others. You asked for a direct answer, and pardon me for being quite direct.
And just a quick addition to that, I mean, I think the problem, and this is what we see again and again in labor standards, is that it's a collective action problem. Some governments feel like they have a competitive problem if they raise labor standards. I think that I agree with George that I think a lot of times, good labor standards are pro-productivity, would actually be in their interest, but in the short run, there's the fear, well, we might lose this or that export sale. Same thing with corporations, where I think, it's to the degree that, the shareholders, if we're not maximizing, are gonna, our share price is gonna go down. It's just very difficult for corporations individually to act, and sometimes governments individually to act. And so I think we need to find ways to get around that collective action problem.
In the back, please.
And by the way, Lynn, if inland revenue didn't tax Starbucks and Amazon, I'm confident the United States government did.
This is the last
You can't escape.
When when corporations use their bottom line to buy the rules from government that they want, how is that different from self-regulation?
If I understood the question, I think I heard a presumption of an answer. The presumption was if corporations buy governments, well, I'd like to reject that flatly. Corporations don't buy governments.
Is there any other answer?
But they do lobby governments on regulation.
Yes.
So that's the question.
Lobbying is different from buying.
But they lobby on regulations. Like they're lobbying on regulations that are going to regulate them. Is that?
I'd rather not get drawn into my own viewpoints about lobbying. I'm distinctly outside of corporate America. I oppose lobbying. I am strongly in favor of public campaign finance and oppose strongly special interests.
I think this was raised when we said that, when we asked the question whether or not corporations which have the ability to influence policy, whether or not they should do it, and I think the answer here on the panel was not, if I remember correctly. So that was, maybe it was phrased in a different way that make it look as a completely different question, but I think that was essentially the question that was asked before by me, and I think the answer was not. One more question, please. We don't have any more time. In the back.
I'd like to follow up on what the woman who preceded me was, where she was going, and that is, we may say that lobbyists don't bribe, and we can talk about the fiction of the lack of influence of money and so on. That is a fiction as we know it in Washington. Politicians are human beings, and lobbyists, as we saw the last fiscal cliff bill, which had only the most basic issues included, had a lot of little cherries for for specific industries. I did want to go back to what Mr. David was talking about in terms of corporations' responsibility to their shareholders. I think there's a tension between short-term and long-term benefits to shareholders, and I think especially if you think of the financial sector, the error is on the extraordinarily short term. I also would like to distinguish, based on the prior intervention, the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. One is technically illegal and the other is because you have a very skilled accountant and attorneys that you are able to skate and do loops around the tax law, even if you did write it, or helped to facilitate and provided technical assistance on a purely advisory level. What I would like to ask is how you think that, given this reality, what is the possibility or arrangements to prevent regulatory capture, especially in the financial sector?
What's the chance of avoiding regulatory capture in the financial sector? Well, yeah, of course, since I'm here to say crazy things. Look, if you have a, I'm going to leave aside, Sir, and just recall Sir Evelyn's a plea that our democracy is in jeopardy because of the current system. Whatever happens in individual cases, there is a feeling, I think a justified feeling, that people are trying to buy our democracy. Just leave that aside. As long as you have a system of laws where the law is made once in a frantic moment and people can lobby in the midst of that moment and get a series of rules which can then be, with the help of skilled advisors, can be further tailored to their needs, there is going to be this form of corporate self-regulation which is just despicable and which makes a mockery of democracy. That is now. I think it's a fortunate accident of the current situation that it is very, very hard, increasingly hard, and seen to be increasingly hard to legislate once and for all in that manner. That is, these new, what you're seeing more and more, and ACA, the Affordable Care Act, is a good example. It is full, it says, we don't know how to do this, and we don't know how to do that, and we're going to start a pilot program, and the bill is not an elegant thing, but it is a clear expression of the limit of even the most befuddled, the inability of the most befuddled legislature we know to not see that it is very hard to write rules that are going to be stable once and for all. If you can't do that, you need some process for ongoing rulemaking and revision. That process involves feedback from the regulated entities, and that it creates a form of transparency which was not previously there for limiting lobbying and the undue influence, punctual influence of interest. So I think the large shift in the nature of lawmaking will be a help in this grievous problem of avoiding capture.
I'd like to just broaden the response for a moment, which is I think there's a presumption in the question, and the discussion so far and the answers have left that presumption unchallenged, which is that it's that businesses are the only people that lobby in Washington. And that is simply not true. That is that there are lobbyists from all different corners of our society, and they're all well-funded, and they all have their own special interests and so on and so forth. And I think to extend my earlier comment, I think the way to deal with this is not to land on one of those multiple constituencies that lobby and say, you're bad because you lobby. The answer is instead to deal with the generalized problem itself, which is to get rid of special interest and to get rid of private campaign finance and move to a more UK or European model to elect our officials. That's the answer, and not to land on one constituency.
Wow. I kind of like that. But anyway, I want to thank our panel, all of whom were forthright, clear, and crisp. Not just George, although especially George. And Stelios for doing such a wonderful job of guiding it at a higher level. We have one all-star panel to go. Michael Froman has just joined us. We have had Danny Roderick and Andy Moravchik with us all day. We've, of course, had Howard Rosen with us all day, but he had to be here. So this is going to be very exciting, but we are going to give you one last coffee break, and the next panel will start promptly at 4 p.m. Thank you very much.